There exists in this world a peculiar alchemy between the deepest wounds of the heart and the most unexpected of healings, a transformation so profound that those who experience it often wonder if they had been living as mere shadows of themselves before love arrived to illuminate the darkness they had grown accustomed to dwelling within. Lady Arabella Thornwood understood the depths of heartbreak with an intimacy that had carved itself into the very marrow of her bones, though she could not yet fathom the heights to which her spirit would eventually soar, nor the extraordinary path that would lead her from resigned acceptance to a joy so complete it would remake her entire understanding of what it meant to be truly cherished. At 23, she was the eldest daughter of Viscount Thornwood, a gentleman of modest means, whose estate in Hampshire had seen better days, and whose coffers had grown increasingly light with each passing year. Arabella possessed what her mother had always called quiet beauty, the sort that did not announce itself from across a crowded ballroom, but rather revealed itself slowly to those patient enough to look beyond the dazzling plumage of more fashionable birds. Her hair was the deep, rich auburn of autumn leaves, touched by the last golden light of October, and it framed a face of delicate features dominated by grey eyes that held within them a thoughtful intelligent society, often overlooked in favour of more vivacious, flirtatious maidens. She carried herself with a dignity that some mistook for coldness, though in truth it was merely the natural reserve of a woman who had learned to observe before speaking, to consider before acting, and to guard the tender chambers of her heart with the careful vigilance of one who understood precisely how devastating it could be to leave such vulnerable territory undefended. 3 years prior, before the wall around her heart had been constructed brick by painful brick, Arabella had believed in love with the innocent fervour of a young woman experiencing her first season in London. Lord Marcus Ashworth, the second son of Baron Ashworth, had possessed golden hair that caught the candlelight, a smile that promised adventures and whispered secrets, and a talent for making a girl feel as though she were the only woman in any room he entered. He had sought her out at assembly rooms and garden parties, had brought her lemonade and secured her hand for waltzes, had spoken to her of poetry and dreams beneath the soft glow of paper lanterns strung through the Countess of Whitmore's famous rose garden. Arabella had allowed herself to believe that this charming, attentive gentleman saw something special in her, something worth pursuing despite her modest dowry and her family's unremarkable standing among the ton. She had permitted hope to take root in her chest, had lain awake at night imagining a future filled with companionship and affection, had written his name in her private journal with a heart full of anticipation for the life they might build together. How young she had been, how terribly, foolishly young, to mistake pretty words for genuine feeling and careful attention for authentic love. The betrayal, when it came, arrived not in private whispers or gentle withdrawal, but in the most public and humiliating manner Lord Marcus Ashworth could have possibly orchestrated, as though he had designed the moment specifically to inflict the maximum possible damage upon a heart that had trusted him completely. Lady Pemberton's annual spring ball was the event of the season that year, and Arabella had dressed with particular care, wearing a gown of pale blue silk that her mother had sacrificed considerably to afford, her auburn hair arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her maid nearly 2 hours to perfect, all because Marcus had hinted that this evening might hold something special, something that would change her future forever. She had allowed herself to imagine a proposal, had pictured herself accepting with tears of joy glistening in her grey eyes, had envisioned writing to her younger sisters the very next morning with news that would secure their futures alongside her own. Instead, she had found Marcus in the centre of the ballroom, his golden head bent attentively toward a dark-haired beauty she did not recognize. His smile, that smile she had believed belonged to her alone, directed at this newcomer with an intensity that made Arabella's stomach clench with sudden, horrible understanding. Miss Patience Coldwell, she would later learn, had arrived in London only 3 days prior, the sole heir to her father's considerable shipping fortune, and Marcus had wasted no time in transferring his attentions to this far more lucrative prospect. When Arabella had approached them, her voice trembling only slightly as she spoke Marcus's name, he had turned to her with an expression of such cold dismissal that she had physically stepped backward, her slippered feet seeking distance from a man she no longer recognized. "Lady Arabella," he had said, and the formal address alone had been a blade to her heart. I do hope you have not been harboring any foolish expectations regarding our acquaintance. You were a pleasant diversion while I waited for a more suitable prospect. Nothing more." The whispers had begun immediately, spreading through the ballroom like fire through dry summer grass, and Arabella had stood frozen in her pretty blue gown, while pitying glances and poorly concealed smirks surrounded her on every side. 2 more seasons she had endured after that catastrophic night, each one more painful than the last, as mothers steered their sons away from the girl who had been so publicly discarded, and gentlemen looked through her as though she were constructed of nothing more substantial than morning mist. Her father's health had begun its steady decline during this period, his heart weakened by worry over debts that mounted with each passing quarter, and Arabella had watched her family's situation grow increasingly precarious, while her own matrimonial prospects withered into nothingness. By the time she reached 23, she had made her peace with spinsterhood, had constructed around her wounded heart a fortress of practical acceptance that no romantic notion would ever again breach, for she understood now with crystalline clarity that love was a luxury she could neither afford nor survive a second time. Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, was a man around whom rumors gathered like storm clouds around a mountain peak, dark and ominous, and endlessly fascinating to those who observed from a safe distance. At 30 years of age, he had inherited his title at the tender age of 12, and had spent the subsequent 18 years transforming himself into a figure of such formidable reputation that mothers warned their daughters not to set their caps at him, and gentlemen took care to speak respectfully in his presence lest they find themselves on the receiving end of his legendary displeasure. He was tall, broad of shoulder, with dark hair that he wore unfashionably short, and features that might have been carved from granite for all the warmth they typically displayed to the world at large. His eyes were the deep blue of a winter twilight, cold and assessing, and they had reduced more than one simpering debutante to stammering incoherence with a single dismissive glance. Society whispered endlessly about why such a man, possessed of ancient title, vast wealth, and considerable physical presence, had never taken a wife, with theories ranging from a broken heart in his youth to preferences that could not be spoken of in polite company to simple, overwhelming arrogance that found no woman worthy of bearing his name. Arabella first encountered this fearsome personage at Lady Whitfield's garden party, an event she had attended only at her mother's tearful insistence that she must continue to show herself in society, despite her advanced age and diminished prospects, and she had been standing apart from the main gathering, seeking a moment's respite from the pitying glances and whispered comments that followed her wherever she went among the ton. She had not realized that the tall gentleman standing partially concealed by an overgrown rose trellis was anyone of consequence, had assumed him merely another guest seeking shade from the afternoon sun, and so when he had made some bland comment about the pleasant weather, she had responded with an honesty that 3 years of humiliation had stripped of all pretense and social caution. "Pleasant weather, perhaps," she had said, her grey eyes fixed on the crowd of eligible young ladies and their calculating mammas, manoeuvring for position around the refreshment table. "But hardly pleasant company, when every conversation is merely a transaction in disguise, and every smile a calculated investment in future advantage." She had expected shock or offense, or the cold dismissal she had grown accustomed to receiving, but when she had finally turned to face her companion, she had found something entirely unexpected in those wintry blue eyes, a flicker of genuine interest, a spark of something that might almost have been amusement, and an intensity of attention that made her feel, for the first time in years, as though she were truly being seen rather than merely assessed and found wanting. "You speak?" the Duke of Ashworth had said, his deep voice carrying a note she could not quite identify, as one who has learned the true nature of society's games through painful experience. And Arabella, meeting his gaze with the steady resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose, had simply nodded, unaware that in that single moment of unguarded honesty, she had captured the attention of a man who had long since despaired of finding anything genuine among the glittering falsehoods of the world into which they had both been born. The Duke of Ashworth called upon Viscount Thornwood precisely 3 days after the garden party, arriving in a carriage of such understated elegance that the neighbours peered from behind their curtains with undisguised curiosity, wondering what business such an elevated personage could possibly have with a family whose fortunes had so visibly declined in recent years. Arabella had been sitting with her father in his study, reviewing household accounts that grew more distressing with each passing month, when the butler announced their unexpected visitor, and she had watched the color drain from her father's already pale face as he struggled to rise from his chair, his weakened heart making even such simple movements an effort that pained her to witness. Sebastian Blackwood entered the modest study like a force of nature contained within the constraints of civilized behavior, his presence somehow making the worn furniture and faded wallpaper seem even shabbier by contrast, yet his expression held none of the contempt Arabella might have expected from a man accustomed to the finest appointments wealth could provide. He addressed her father with a respect that surprised her, speaking plainly and without the elaborate social flourishes that typically characterized such visits, and as Arabella sat in stunned silence, she learned that the Duke of Ashworth had come to request her hand in marriage. His reasoning, laid out with the same cool precision he might have employed in discussing a business arrangement, was entirely practical. He required a wife to fulfill his duty to his title, a woman capable of managing his considerable household, someone intelligent enough to provide stimulating companionship and sensible enough not to burden him with romantic expectations or emotional demands. He had observed Lady Arabella, he explained, and found her to possess exactly the qualities he sought: a sharp mind, an honest tongue, a dignity that remained unbroken despite circumstances that might have crushed a lesser spirit. The terms he offered made Arabella's breath catch in her throat: complete settlement of her family's debts, generous dowries for her younger sisters that would secure their futures regardless of what matches they might make, a quarterly allowance for her parents that would ensure their comfort for the remainder of their lives, and for Arabella herself, the full privileges and protections afforded to the Duchess of Ashworth. Her father looked to her with eyes that held both hope and apology, understanding that he was in no position to refuse such an offer, yet unwilling to compel his daughter into a marriage she did not want, and Arabella felt the weight of her family's future settling upon her shoulders, like a mantle she had not asked to wear, but could not in good conscience set aside. She thought of her sisters, bright and hopeful, deserving of chances she herself had been denied. She thought of her mother, worn thin with worry. She thought of her father, dying slowly under the burden of debts he could never repay. And she thought of herself, of the foolish girl who had once believed in love, and the pragmatic woman who had learned better through bitter experience. Security, stability, the salvation of everyone she loved, all of this could be hers, if only she was willing to surrender the last, secret ember of romantic hope she had not quite managed to extinguish. And as she met the Duke's winter blue gaze across her father's shabby study, she found herself wondering whether such a sacrifice was truly a sacrifice at all, or simply the final step in becoming the woman circumstance had always intended her to be. Arabella requested a private audience with the Duke before she would give her final answer, a bold move for a woman in her position, yet Sebastian Blackwood merely inclined his head in agreement and followed her to the small parlour that had once been elegant and now showed the gentle decay of genteel poverty in its faded curtains and threadbare carpet. She stood before the window, her back straight, her hands clasped before her to hide their trembling, and when she finally turned to face him, she found him watching her with that same intensity she had encountered at the garden party, as though he could see past the careful composure she presented to the world and glimpse the frightened, wounded creature that dwelt beneath. "I will accept your offer, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the tumult in her heart, "but I must be entirely honest with you about the terms upon which I do so." He said nothing, merely waited with the patience of a man accustomed to having his every word attended to, and his silence gave her the courage to continue. "I will be your wife in every way that duty requires," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I will manage your household with competence. I will bear your heirs if God wills it. I will conduct myself in society in a manner that brings no shame upon your name, but I will never love you." The words hung in the air between them, stark and final, and Arabella watched his face for any sign of anger or offense, prepared for the cold dismissal that would surely follow such an impertinent declaration from a woman who should have been grateful simply to be chosen. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat. The corner of his stern mouth curved upward in a smile, small but unmistakable, and his winter blue eyes warmed with something that looked almost like knowing amusement, as though she had told a jest whose punchline only he understood. "I accept your terms, Lady Arabella," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of something she could not identify. "And I appreciate your honesty more than you could possibly know." The engagement was announced in the Times 3 days later, and society reacted with the mixture of shock and avid curiosity that Arabella had expected, but still found exhausting to endure. Whispers followed her everywhere. How had a woman of modest fortune and tarnished reputation managed to secure the most eligible bachelor in England? What hold could she possibly have over a man who had rejected diamonds of the first water without a second glance? Surely there must be some scandal, some secret, some explanation beyond the impossible notion that the Duke of Ashworth had simply chosen her. Arabella endured the speculation with the quiet dignity that had become her armor, attending the necessary social engagements on Sebastian's arm, accepting congratulations that dripped with barely concealed envy or confusion, and all the while reminding herself that this was a practical arrangement, nothing more, a transaction that would save her family and provide her with security, and that the curious warmth she felt when Sebastian's hand touched the small of her back, guiding her through crowded ballrooms, was merely gratitude, merely relief, merely the natural response to safety after years of uncertainty, and certainly, absolutely, not the first treacherous stirrings of something she had sworn never to feel again. The wedding took place on a morning in late spring, when the gardens of Blackwood Manor blazed with roses and the air hung heavy with their perfume, and Arabella spoke her vows in a voice that did not tremble, her grey eyes meeting Sebastian's winter-blue gaze with the steady composure of a woman entering a business arrangement rather than a love match. Yet something in the way he looked at her, as he slid the ring upon her finger, a look of quiet intensity that she could not quite decipher, made her pulse quicken, despite her resolve to feel nothing at all. The ceremony itself was tasteful rather than ostentatious, attended by the cream of society, who had come as much to witness this improbable union as to celebrate it, and Arabella endured their curious stares with the dignity that had become her shield, grateful when the wedding breakfast concluded and the guests finally departed, leaving her alone in her new home with a husband who was still very much a stranger. Blackwood Manor exceeded anything her imagination had conjured during the weeks of their engagement, a magnificent Palladian structure of honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon light, surrounded by grounds so vast and perfectly maintained that they might have been painted rather than cultivated, with gardens that stretched toward distant woods and a lake that glittered like scattered diamonds beneath the sun. The interior proved equally overwhelming: grand halls adorned with portraits of stern-faced Blackwood ancestors, drawing rooms furnished with pieces that cost more than her father's entire estate, and servants who moved through the corridors with silent efficiency, treating Arabella with a deference that felt foreign after years of managing her family's modest household with a staff of 3. But it was the library that stole her breath entirely. 2 stories of books rising toward a painted ceiling, leather spines gleaming in rows that seemed to stretch toward infinity, with a rolling ladder and deep chairs positioned near windows that flooded the space with golden light. And Arabella stood in the doorway of that magnificent room, feeling something dangerous bloom in her chest, something that might have been happiness if she had allowed herself to name it. Their days settled into a pattern of careful courtesy, breakfasts taken together in a silence that was not uncomfortable, separate pursuits during the daylight hours, dinners where they discussed estate matters and neutral topics with the politeness of acquaintances rather than spouses, and each evening they retired to their separate chambers, his in the east wing, hers in the west, connected by a door that remained firmly closed. Arabella told herself she was grateful for the distance, for a husband who demanded nothing beyond her presence and her competence, yet she found herself noticing small things that did not fit the narrative she had constructed. Vases of white camellias appearing fresh in her sitting room each morning, though she had never told anyone they were her favorites. Volumes of poetry she had mentioned admiring suddenly present in the library, placed where she would easily find them. A pianoforte delivered to the music room when she had made only passing reference to missing her mother's instrument. Coincidence, she told herself firmly. Nothing more than the efficient household management of a wealthy estate, and if her heart whispered otherwise, she refused to listen. The discovery came about quite by accident, as so many significant moments do, when Sebastian entered the morning room unannounced and found Arabella bent over a small sketchbook, her lower lip caught between her teeth in concentration, her fingers smudged with the faint traces of pigment from the modest set of watercolors. she had brought from her father's house, the only luxury she had permitted herself during years of careful economy. She startled at his presence, closing the book with guilty haste, but not before he glimpsed the delicate rendering of the rose garden visible through the window, captured with a skill that spoke of natural talent long denied proper nurturing. "You paint," he said, and it was not a question but a statement of discovery, his winter blue eyes lingering on the worn edges of her sketchbook, the cheap brushes with their fraying bristles, the small tin of colors that had clearly been used and reused until the pigments were nearly exhausted. Arabella felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed to have her modest pursuit exposed before a man who owned galleries full of masterworks by the great artists of the age. "I dabble," she said dismissively. "A childish hobby, nothing more, and one I have largely abandoned." He said nothing further, merely inclined his head and departed, and Arabella thought the matter forgotten until 3 days later, when she entered her private sitting room to find it transformed. An elegant easel stood before the window where the light fell most perfectly. Beside it, a table laden with supplies that made her breath catch in her throat, watercolors of the finest quality from Winsor and Newton, brushes of sable so soft they felt like whispered promises against her fingertips, papers of varying weights and textures, and small bottles of ox, gall and gum Arabic, and every medium a serious watercolorist might require. She found Sebastian in his study, her heart pounding with an emotion she refused to name, and when she thanked him with stiff formality, her voice carefully stripped of the overwhelming gratitude that threatened to crack her composure, he merely glanced up from his correspondence with an expression of mild disinterest. "An estate of this size requires artwork," he said, his tone dismissive. "Landscapes for the guest chambers, botanicals for the conservatory, and since you apparently possess some skill in that direction, you might as well make yourself useful." It was a reasonable explanation, practical and devoid of sentiment, exactly what she should have expected from a man who had proposed marriage as a business arrangement, and yet something in his words rang false, a dissonance she could not quite identify until she encountered Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, later that afternoon. His Grace spent the better part of 2 days selecting those supplies, the older woman mentioned, her weathered face soft with an expression that might have been fondness, visited 3 different merchants in the village, and sent to London for the rest, very particular. He was about the quality, said only the finest would do for her Grace. Arabella stood in the hallway after Mrs. Hartley departed, her mind turning over this information like a gem held to the light, examining its facets, and she found herself watching Sebastian more closely in the days that followed, noticing the way his gaze would drift to her sitting room door when he passed, the almost imperceptible softening of his stern features when she mentioned beginning a new painting, the careful attention he paid when she spoke of color and light and composition, as though her words were worthy of genuine consideration rather than mere polite tolerance. And she wondered, with growing confusion and a flutter of something dangerous beneath her breastbone, how a man so cold could perform such acts of thoughtful kindness, and what it might mean that he did so while pretending they meant nothing at all. It began, as such things often do, without either of them quite noticing, an evening when rain lashed against the windows, and Arabella sought refuge in the library, only to find Sebastian already ensconced in his usual chair by the fire, a volume of Plutarch open upon his knee, and rather than retreating to her own chambers as propriety might have suggested, she found herself settling into the chair opposite his, selecting a book at random and losing herself in the comfortable silence that stretched between them like a bridge neither had consciously chosen to build. That first evening became a second, and a second became a third, until their nightly meetings in the library transformed from accident into ritual, from ritual into something Arabella found herself anticipating with a warmth she did not care to examine too closely, and it was during these quiet hours that she began to discover the man behind the glacial facade, the dry wit that emerged when he quoted particularly absurd passages from parliamentary proceedings, the genuine curiosity with which he solicited her opinions on everything from agricultural reform to the merits of Gothic novels, the way his severe features would soften almost imperceptibly when she said something that surprised a laugh from his guarded heart. "You find the Corn Laws amusing, then?" he remarked one evening, when she had ventured an opinion on economic policy that clearly caught him off guard. And though his tone remained cool, she detected something like admiration flickering in those winter blue depths. She learned, in fragments and half-sentences offered between discussions of Wordsworth and debates about estate drainage, of the childhood that had shaped him, parents lost to fever when he was barely 7, guardians more interested in preserving the Blackwood fortune than nurturing the boy who would inherit it, a youth spent in grand houses that echoed with emptiness, educated by tutors who taught him duty and discipline but never demonstrated affection. "One learns," he said quietly, staring into the fire rather than meeting her eyes, "to require nothing from others, and thus to never be disappointed." And Arabella felt something twist painfully in her chest, recognizing in his words an echo of her own carefully constructed defenses. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own history that she had never spoken aloud, the terror of watching her mother's slow decline, the weight of responsibility for her younger sisters, the small dreams she had quietly surrendered one by one as their circumstances narrowed, dreams of travel and learning and a life larger than the confines society permitted. Sebastian listened with an attention that felt like sunlight after years of shadow, asking questions that proved he truly heard her, remembering details she mentioned in passing and returning to them days later, and she realized with growing wonder that this stern, supposedly cold man saw her more clearly than anyone ever had, valued her mind as much as her competence, and found her worthy of genuine conversation rather than mere polite discourse. A tentative friendship took root in that firelit library, growing stronger with each shared evening, and though Arabella continued to remind herself that friendship was all this could ever be, she could not quite silence the small voice within her that whispered of possibilities she had sworn never to consider again. The summons arrived on a grey February morning, an elegantly penned reminder that duty extended far beyond the peaceful sanctuary they had created at Blackwood Manor, and Arabella felt her heart sink as she read the words that announced what she had been dreading since the day she became a duchess. They must attend the London season, must take their place among the glittering throng of society, must face the whispers and the stares, and the endless speculation about how a woman of her modest origins and tarnished reputation had somehow captured the most eligible bachelor in England. The weeks of preparation passed in a blur of fittings and consultations, modistes arriving from London with bolts of silk and satin in every conceivable shade, and though the gowns they created were exquisite beyond anything Arabella had ever imagined wearing, she could summon no excitement for the season ahead, only a creeping dread that coiled tighter in her stomach with each passing day. Sebastian noticed. Of course she had learned that very little escaped those observant winter blue eyes, but he said nothing of her pallor, her distracted silences, the way her hands trembled slightly when she reviewed the invitations that poured in from every corner of fashionable society, hostesses who had once overlooked her entirely, now desperate to secure the attendance of the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth at their entertainments. The night of their first ball arrived with the inexorability of fate, and Arabella stood before her mirror in the London townhouse, dressed in a gown of midnight blue silk that the modiste had promised would complement her colouring perfectly, yet seeing only the ghost of the girl who had once been publicly humiliated in a ballroom not unlike the one she would enter tonight. A knock at her chamber door startled her from her melancholy reverie, and when her maid opened it to reveal Sebastian standing in the doorway, resplendent in black evening clothes that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the commanding nature of his presence, Arabella felt her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with her corset. He carried a velvet case in his hands, long and flat, and when he crossed the room to stand before her, his expression was unreadable in that way she had once found intimidating, but now recognized as his particular form of emotional restraint. "These have not been worn since my grandmother's time," he said quietly, opening the case to reveal a necklace that stole the very air from Arabella's lungs, sapphires, the color of twilight seas, surrounded by diamonds that caught the candlelight and scattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows, a piece of such magnificence that she could not imagine it resting against her ordinary skin. He moved behind her to fasten the clasp himself, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck in a touch that sent shivers cascading down her spine, and when she met his eyes in the mirror, she saw something fierce burning in those icy depths, something that looked almost like pride. "You are my Duchess," he said, his voice low and intense, carrying a weight of meaning that seemed to reach beyond the simple statement of fact. "Let no one forget it." The possessive warmth in his tone made her heart flutter dangerously, traitorously, and as they descended the staircase to the waiting carriage, his hand steady and sure at the small of her back. Arabella wondered how much longer she could pretend that her carefully constructed walls remained intact. Lady Pemberton's ballroom had not changed in the 3 years since Arabella's humiliation. The same gilded mirrors reflected the same glittering chandeliers, the same hothouse flowers perfumed the same overheated air, and the same curious eyes followed her every movement as she entered on Sebastian's arm, though now those eyes held speculation rather than pity, envy rather than contempt, and she drew strength from the solid presence beside her, from the weight of the Blackwood sapphires against her collarbone, from the knowledge that whatever whispers followed her tonight, she faced them not as a rejected spinster, but as a duchess, whose husband had declared before her mirror that she belonged to him. They had been in attendance perhaps an hour, navigating the treacherous waters of society, with Sebastian's glacial demeanor serving as an effective shield against the most impertinent inquiries, when Arabella excused herself to find refreshment and found instead, standing directly in her path as though he had been lying in wait, the man whose cruelty had nearly destroyed her, Lord Marcus Ashworth, older now, lines of discontent bracketing his mouth, his handsome features gone slightly soft with dissipation and disappointment. Lady Arabella, he drawled, deliberately omitting her new title, his eyes travelling over her form with an insolence that made her skin crawl. Or should I say, Your Grace, though I confess, the elevation still astonishes me. Who would have thought our little country mouse would climb so high? Arabella's spine stiffened, 3 years of carefully buried hurt rising like bile in her throat. But before she could formulate a response that would be both cutting and dignified, Marcus continued, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearby guests who had begun to take notice of their exchange. One cannot help but wonder, he mused with poisonous sweetness, what particular talents you employed to secure such an unlikely match. The Duke is not known for charitable impulses, after all, and your family's circumstances were rather desperate, were they not? The insinuation hung in the air like smoke, ugly and unmistakable, and Arabella felt the color drain from her face even as she lifted her chin, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. But the words she needed would not come, her throat closing around responses that seemed inadequate to counter such deliberate cruelty. She became aware of a sudden shift in the atmosphere around them, a dropping of temperature that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the tall figure who had materialized at her side, and when she glanced up at Sebastian's face, she felt a shiver of something that was not quite fear. His expression had gone utterly cold, colder than she had ever seen it, his winter blue eyes fixed upon Marcus with a predatory intensity that made the other man take an involuntary step backward. "Lord Marcus," Sebastian said, and his voice carried that particular quality of aristocratic disdain that could silence an entire room, which it very nearly did, conversations dying away as the assembled guests turned to witness what promised to be a spectacle of the first order. "I could not help but overhear your remarks to my wife." The silence that followed Sebastian's words was absolute, the kind of crystalline stillness that precedes a storm, and Arabella watched as every guest within earshot seemed to hold their breath, fans frozen mid-flutter, glasses suspended halfway to lips, all eyes fixed upon the tableau unfolding before them, the Duke of Ashworth, whose cold displeasure was legendary, whose social power was unrivaled, standing in terrible judgment over the man who had once broken his wife's heart. "I find myself curious," Sebastian continued, his voice carrying that deceptive softness that Arabella had learned to recognize as far more dangerous than any shout. "What particular qualifications you possess, Lord Marcus, that embolden you to question the worthiness of my Duchess, a woman whose intelligence, dignity, and character surpass that of anyone else in this room, yourself most especially." Marcus's face had gone an unbecoming shade of red, his earlier smugness crumbling like ash before the force of Sebastian's contempt, and he opened his mouth as if to defend himself. But Sebastian was not finished, would not be finished until he had dismantled this man as thoroughly as Marcus had once dismantled Arabella's innocent heart. "I chose the Duchess of Ashworth," Sebastian declared, his voice rising just enough to ensure that every person in the ballroom could hear him clearly. "Not despite her circumstances, but because in a sea of simpering fortune-hunting debutantes, she alone possessed the courage to speak honestly, the grace to maintain her dignity in the face of cruel treatment by those unworthy to polish her shoes, and the rare quality of genuine worth that no amount of inherited wealth could ever purchase." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests, and Arabella saw the tide of opinion shifting before her eyes, saw the way ladies who had once whispered behind their fans now looked at her with new respect, saw the gentleman nodding in approval of a husband who defended his wife so magnificently. "I consider myself," Sebastian continued, fixing Marcus with a stare that seemed capable of freezing blood, "extraordinarily fortunate that she accepted my suit, and I will remind you and everyone present that an insult to the Duchess of Ashworth is an insult to me personally, and I am not known for my forgiving nature." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable and absolute, and Marcus seemed to shrink before it, his bravado collapsing entirely as he stammered something that might have been an apology before retreating hastily into the crowd, his unhappy wife following with a expression of sour resignation. Sebastian turned to Arabella then, and what she saw in his eyes stole her breath entirely, not the cold fury he had directed at Marcus, but something fierce and tender and protective, something that looked remarkably like devotion, and she felt it then, the first definitive crack in the wall she had so carefully constructed around her wounded heart. He offered his arm with perfect formality, as though he had not just publicly devastated a man on her behalf, as though her world had not just shifted on its axis, and as Arabella placed her trembling fingers on his sleeve and allowed him to lead her back into the safety of the crowd, she understood with sudden, terrifying clarity that her careful declaration that she would never love him had become the most fragile of lies. The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones as they departed Lady Pemberton's residence, and Arabella sat in the velvet darkness, her heart pounding so fiercely she feared Sebastian must hear it across the small space that separated them, the events of the evening replaying in her mind with such vivid intensity that she could scarcely breathe the cruelty in Marcus's voice, the way Sebastian had appeared beside her like an avenging angel wrapped in evening black, the devastating precision of his defense, and most of all, that look in his eyes when he had turned to her afterward, that fierce tenderness that had shattered something fundamental within her carefully constructed walls. "I must thank you," she said finally, her voice emerging smaller than she intended, trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure, "for what you did tonight for defending me against Lord Marcus's accusations." Sebastian made a dismissive sound, his profile barely visible in the dim light that filtered through the carriage windows from the street lamps they passed. "I merely defended my own honor," he replied, his tone carrying that familiar coolness. "An insult to my wife is an insult to my name, and I will not tolerate aspersions cast upon either." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, entirely consistent with the practical arrangement they had agreed upon, and yet Arabella found she could not accept it, could not reconcile those distant words with the blazing protectiveness she had witnessed, with the way his voice had resonated with something far deeper than wounded pride when he had declared her worthy, intelligent, deserving of respect. She was formulating a response, something polite and accepting that would allow them both to retreat to safer ground, when she felt it, his hand finding hers in the darkness, his fingers warm and strong as they interlaced with her own, and he held her with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his forbidding reputation. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them in that touch, some acknowledgement that could not yet be voiced, and Arabella felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes as she recognized the danger she was in, not the danger of heartbreak, which she had guarded against so vigilantly, but something far more terrifying, the danger of hope, of believing that perhaps this man who had married her for practical reasons might feel something more, might cherish her in ways she had forbidden herself to dream of. As the carriage carried them through the London streets toward their townhouse, Arabella found herself cataloguing evidence she had tried so hard to dismiss: the flowers that appeared each morning in her favorite varieties, the books selected with such obvious attention to her tastes, the art supplies of finest quality, the sapphires he had placed around her throat with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, and tonight, this devastating public defense that went so far beyond the requirements of protecting one's honor. He had never demanded anything from her, she realized with sudden, startling clarity, not affection, not gratitude, not even the martial rights that were legally his to claim. He had simply given, consistently and thoughtfully, asking nothing in return except her presence at his table and her conversation in his library. She tightened her fingers around his, feeling him respond in kind, and acknowledged to herself what she could not yet speak aloud. Her feelings had changed, were changing still, and the declaration she had made on the day of their engagement that she would never love him had begun to feel less like a shield and more like a lie she told, to protect herself from the terrifying possibility that love, real love, might find her after all. The invitations began arriving the very next morning, a veritable flood of cream-colored cards and elegantly penned requests that threatened to overwhelm the silver tray upon which the butler presented them, and Arabella could scarcely comprehend the transformation that had occurred seemingly overnight. Ladies who had once offered her nothing but pitying glances and whispered condolences now wrote effusively of their desire to call upon her, to host her at intimate luncheons, to secure her presence at their most exclusive gatherings, as though the Duchess of Ashworth had always been the most sought-after woman in London, rather than the quietly humiliated daughter of a modest viscount whom society had largely forgotten. She navigated this sudden elevation with a grace that surprised even herself, drawing upon reserves of dignity she had cultivated during those painful years of social exile, and she found that the skills she had developed in enduring whispered cruelties served her equally well. In accepting effusive compliments, she remained composed, warm but not overly eager, generous in her attention without appearing desperate for approval, and society, which had such keen instincts for detecting weakness or pretension, responded to her genuineness with something that felt remarkably like genuine respect rather than mere deference to her husband's title. Sebastian watched her navigate these waters with an expression that made her pulse quicken whenever she caught him observing her across crowded drawing rooms or glittering ballrooms. There was pride in his dark eyes, unmistakable and warming, as though her social triumphs pleased him, not because they reflected well upon his choice, but because he genuinely delighted in seeing her flourish, in watching her step into a place she had always deserved, but had been denied by the cruelty of shallow men and the fickleness of fortune. The touches between them had begun to multiply in ways that Arabella could no longer attribute to mere politeness or the necessities of social performance. His hand, at the small of her back, as they entered a room, lingered longer than propriety required, warm and possessive through the silk of her gown, and she found herself leaning into his touch rather than maintaining the careful distance she had once preserved so vigilantly. One evening, before a particularly grand dinner, she reached up without thinking to adjust the knot of his cravat, her fingers brushing against the warm column of his throat, and the sharp intake of his breath, the way his eyes darkened as they held hers, sent a cascade of sensation through her that she could no longer pretend was anything other than desire. The household staff observed these changes with knowing glances and barely suppressed smiles, and Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who had served the Blackwood family for 3 decades, confided to the cook that she had never seen His Grace so content, that the new Duchess had worked some manner of magic upon a man everyone had believed incapable of warmth, and these whispered assessments filtered back to Arabella through the chambermaid who attended her, offering external confirmation of what she was only beginning to allow herself to believe, that this marriage of convenience was transforming into something neither of them had anticipated, something that grew stronger with each shared glance and accidental touch, something that looked remarkably, terrifyingly, wonderfully like love. The return to Blackwood Manor felt like coming home in a way Arabella had never anticipated. The sprawling estate, welcoming them with its ancient oaks and manicured gardens, its ivy-covered walls and windows that caught the afternoon light like faceted jewels, and she found herself breathing more easily as the carriage rolled up the long drive, leaving behind the glittering pressures of London society for the quieter rhythms of country life, where she and Sebastian might simply be themselves without the constant observation of the ton. Their days settled into patterns that Arabella cherished more than she dared admit, long walks through the gardens where late summer roses perfumed the air, and Sebastian offered his arm with a naturalness that suggested he had always been meant to walk beside her. Their conversations ranging from the philosophical to the absurd, from discussions of estate management to debates about which of the kitchen cats was the cleverest, and she discovered that making him laugh, truly laugh, with that rare unguarded sound that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish, had become one of her greatest pleasures. He insisted upon teaching her to ride properly, declaring that the Duchess of Ashworth should not be limited to sedate ambles on elderly mares, and though she protested her lack of skill, she found herself mounted on a spirited chestnut mare named Cressida, Sebastian's patient instruction guiding her through the basics until she could canter across the meadows with something approaching confidence, his pride in her progress evident in the warmth of his gaze when she successfully took a low fence without unseating herself. In return, she taught him to see beauty in small moments. He might otherwise have overlooked the particular quality of light through morning mist, the intricate architecture of a spider's web jeweled with dew, the way the gardener's young daughter laughed while chasing butterflies through the lavender, and she watched something in him soften as he learned to pause, to observe, to find wonder in the ordinary miracles that wealth and responsibility had trained him to ignore. The physical awareness between them grew with each passing day, becoming impossible to dismiss or explain away the brush of his fingers against hers when he handed her a book, sent electricity crackling through her veins, and she caught him watching her with an intensity that made her breath quicken and her cheeks flush, his dark eyes following her movements across a room as though she were a puzzle he was determined to solve, a treasure he could not quite believe was his. The tension when they parted each night for their separate chambers had become almost unbearable. A moment of hesitation in the corridor where they stood closer than necessity demanded, where the air between them felt charged with unspoken possibility, and Arabella would lie awake in her elegant room, wondering what might happen if she simply crossed the distance between their doors, if she abandoned the careful boundaries she had established with her declaration that she would never love him. But what was this feeling, she asked herself in the darkness, if not love, this ache in her chest when he smiled at her, this warmth that spread through her entire being when he spoke her name, this desperate wish that he might feel even a fraction of what she felt for him? The thunderstorm descended upon Blackwood Manor with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient estate, lightning splitting the sky in brilliant, jagged forks, while thunder rolled across the grounds like the drums of some celestial army. And Arabella found herself utterly unable to sleep, despite the lateness of the hour, her nerves too jangled by the tempest's fury, and her thoughts too consumed by the man who slumbered, or perhaps did not slumber, in chambers separated from hers by a mere stretch of corridor that had come to feel like an insurmountable distance. She wrapped herself in a silk dressing gown and made her way through the darkened halls toward the library, that sanctuary where she had spent so many evening hours in Sebastian's company, thinking perhaps that a book might calm her restless mind, and she was startled to find candlelight already flickering within, casting dancing shadows across the spines of countless volumes, and more startled still to discover Sebastian standing at the window, his shirt untucked and his feet bare, watching the storm's display with an expression she had never seen. Upon his features, something raw and unguarded, almost vulnerable, as though the tempest had stripped away the careful control he maintained so effortlessly in daylight hours. He turned at the sound of her entrance, and for a long moment neither spoke, the thunder rolling between them like the externalization of all the tension that had been building through weeks of meaningful glances and accidental touches, and words that approached but never quite crossed the boundaries of mere friendship. "I could not sleep," she offered unnecessarily, and he nodded, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. And when he spoke, his voice was different, rougher, stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. "Arabella," he said, and the sound of her Christian name upon his lips sent warmth flooding through her. "There is something I must tell you, though I fear the telling of it, though I have no right to burden you with truths you did not ask to hear." She moved closer, drawn by something stronger than curiosity, and he turned to face her fully, his hands clenching at his sides as though he were physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "When I proposed our arrangement, I told you I sought a practical wife, a sensible match uncomplicated by romantic expectations," he continued, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort, "and I allowed you to believe that I chose you for your intelligence and dignity, which I did. But there was more, so much more, because the truth is that I fell in love with you at that garden party, when you spoke so fiercely about the shallowness of society matchmaking, when your grey eyes flashed with honest feeling that cut through the pretense I had grown so weary of enduring." He paused, his voice breaking slightly as lightning illuminated the planes of his face. "I chose you because something in your honest heart called to something in mine that I had believed long dead. I know you cannot love me, you made that clear, and I have tried to accept it, to be content with your companionship and your friendship, but I find I cannot continue pretending that friendship is all I feel, that practical arrangement is all I desire. I love you, Arabella, completely, and I needed you to know the truth, even if it changes nothing. The walls she had so carefully constructed, brick by painstaking brick over 3 long years of self-protection, crumbled in that moment like ancient fortifications before an unstoppable force, and Arabella felt tears streaming down her cheeks before she even registered that she was crying. Her heart laid bare by his confession in a way that terrified her, even as it filled her with a desperate, aching hope she had sworn never to permit herself to feel again. "Sebastian," she whispered, and her voice broke on his name. "You must understand, it is not that I cannot love you. It was never that I was incapable of such feeling, but rather that I was terrified, so deeply and thoroughly terrified, of what loving might cost me, of the devastation that would surely follow if I allowed myself to hope and found that hope betrayed once more." She moved toward him as though drawn by an invisible thread, her feet carrying her across the carpet until she stood close enough to see the vulnerability etched into every line of his beloved face, the fear in his dark eyes that she might reject this precious gift he had offered her. "When Marcus discarded me so publicly, so cruelly, I thought I would die from the shame of it, from the knowledge that I had given my heart to someone who viewed it as nothing more than a temporary amusement, and I swore that I would never again be so foolish, never again allow anyone close enough to wound me so grievously." Her hands reached out of their own accord, pressing against his chest where she could feel the rapid beating of his heart, and she marveled that this powerful man, this duke whom all of society feared, could tremble beneath her touch. "But you," she continued, her voice growing stronger even as more tears fell, "you have made it impossible to keep that vow, impossible to maintain the careful distance I thought would protect me, because every kindness you have shown me, every thoughtful gesture, every moment of genuine interest in my thoughts and dreams and fears, has worn away at my defenses until I found myself loving you despite every wall I tried to build, despite every warning I gave myself, despite the absolute certainty that loving you would destroy me if you did not feel the same." She drew a shuddering breath, her grey eyes meeting his with an honesty that left her utterly exposed. "I love you, Sebastian. I did not want to. I fought against it with every fibre of my being, but I love you completely, irrevocably, with a depth of feeling I did not know I possessed." The words had barely left her lips before his arms were around her, pulling her against him with a fierce tenderness that stole her breath, and then his mouth found hers in a kiss that was everything she had never dared to dream, claiming and cherishing, passionate and reverent, a declaration more eloquent than any words could ever be, and she surrendered to it utterly, her arms twining around his neck as the storm raged on outside, unheeded and forgotten. The kiss deepened and transformed, becoming something that transcended mere physical contact and entered the realm of soul-deep communion. And when Sebastian finally drew back just far enough to look into her eyes, his own were blazing with a passion that made her tremble even as she reached for him again, unwilling to allow even inches of distance between them. "Arabella," he breathed against her lips, "my love, my heart, tell me to stop, and I will. Tell me you need time, and I will wait an eternity. But know that I want nothing more than to show you what you mean to me, to worship you as you deserve to be worshipped." Her answer was not in words, but in the way she pressed herself closer, in the way her fingers tangled in his dark hair, in the soft sound of yearning that escaped her throat, and he understood, sweeping her into his arms with a strength that made her gasp, and carrying her from the library through the shadowed corridors while the storm continued its symphony outside, lightning illuminating their path in brilliant flashes, as though the very heavens celebrated this union so long delayed. His chambers were warm from the fire that still crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow across the massive bed, where he laid her down with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes, and as he joined her there, his hands trembling slightly as they traced the contours of her face, she understood at last that physical love between two people who truly cherished one another was not the surrender she had feared, but rather a mutual gift, a shared vulnerability that strengthened rather than diminished, an act of profound trust that bound two souls together in ways that mere words could never accomplish. They came together with a passion tempered by reverence, his every touch designed to bring her pleasure, his every whispered word a declaration of devotion, and Arabella discovered within herself a capacity for feeling that she had never known existed. Sensations, building upon sensations, until she shattered in his arms, and he followed her into that blissful oblivion, their cries mingling with the rolling thunder outside. Afterward, they lay entwined beneath silken sheets, her head upon his chest, where she could hear the gradually slowing rhythm of his heart, his fingers tracing lazy patterns upon her bare shoulder, and she felt a peace so profound it seemed impossible that she had ever lived without it, that she had spent so many years building walls against this very possibility. When morning came, grey light filtering through rain-washed windows to paint the room in soft watercolor hues, Arabella woke to find herself still cradled in Sebastian's arms, his sleeping face inches from her own, and she lay perfectly still for long moments, simply watching him, marveling at how different he looked in repose. The stern lines of his features softened, his dark lashes fanning against his cheeks, his lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile, as though even his dreams were pleasant now. Her heart swelled with an emotion so vast and overwhelming that she feared it might break free from the confines of her chest. But this was not the sharp, shattering pain of heartbreak she had known before. This was something entirely different, an expansion rather than a destruction. Joy so complete, it bordered on the unbearable. He stirred, his arms tightening around her instinctively, and when his eyes opened to meet hers, the love she saw reflected in their dark depths matched perfectly the love that blazed within her own soul. The grand ball at Blackwood Manor surpassed anything the county had witnessed in a generation, with hundreds of candles blazing in crystal chandeliers that cast their golden light across silk-draped walls and polished marble floors, the scent of hothouse flowers perfuming air that hummed with the strains of a full orchestra. And at the center of it all stood Arabella, resplendent in a gown of deep sapphire silk that matched the legendary Blackwood gems glittering at her throat. Her auburn hair swept into an elaborate arrangement that drew admiring glances from every corner of the vast ballroom. But it was not the magnificence of her attire that made her truly radiant. It was the unmistakable glow of a woman beloved and loving in return, a happiness so profound it seemed to emanate from her very being and touch everyone who beheld her. Sebastian remained close throughout the evening, his hand finding the small of her back with easy familiarity, his dark eyes meeting hers across crowded conversations with a warmth that made her heart flutter even now, after weeks of waking in his arms, and society watched them with fascination, whispers spreading through the assembled guests that the Duke of Ashworth, that notorious iceberg of the ton, had been utterly transformed by his unlikely Duchess. The cream of society had answered their invitation, drawn by curiosity and the undeniable social currency of an event hosted by one of England's most powerful families, and among the glittering throng stood Lord Marcus Ashworth and his wife. The former heiress whose fortune had proven insufficient compensation for a lifetime bound to a shallow, bitter man, her face was pinched with perpetual dissatisfaction, her complaints audible even above the music, while Marcus himself could not seem to prevent his gaze from following Arabella around the room, something dark and envious flickering in his eyes each time she laughed at her husband's murmured words. When Sebastian called for silence and raised his crystal glass, every voice in the ballroom fell away, and Arabella felt her cheeks flush with anticipation as he turned to face the assembled company, his commanding presence drawing every eye. "I wish to propose a toast," he declared, his deep voice carrying to the farthest corners of the room, "to my Duchess, who honored me beyond measure when she consented to become my wife, who has transformed this house into a home, and who has taught me that the greatest treasures in life cannot be measured in lands or titles, but only in the immeasurable worth of a heart, freely given to Arabella, the finest woman I have ever known, and the keeper of my heart for all my remaining days." The sincerity ringing in every word left no room for doubt, and as glasses rose throughout the ballroom, Arabella saw Lady Whitmore dabbing at her eyes, saw young debutantes sighing with romantic longing, saw matrons nodding approvingly at this evidence that even the coldest duke could be warmed by the right woman, and across the room she saw Marcus's face contort with bitter recognition of what he had so carelessly discarded, what he could never hope to reclaim. Sebastian's hand found hers as the toast concluded, his fingers intertwining with her own in full view of everyone present, and when he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with tender reverence, Arabella knew that this moment represented more than social triumph. It was the complete and public recognition of a love that had grown from the most unpromising of beginnings into something rare and precious beyond all measure. 5 years had passed since that fateful thunderstorm, 5 years of joy so complete that Arabella sometimes paused in the midst of ordinary moments, simply to marvel at the extraordinary life that had unfolded from such unpromising beginnings. And on this particular summer afternoon, the gardens of Blackwood Manor rang with sounds that would have seemed impossible to the guarded, wounded woman she had once been. The delighted shrieks of twin daughters chasing butterflies through the rose beds, their auburn curls bouncing as they ran, their grey eyes sparkling with mischief inherited from their mother, and knowing smiles that were unmistakably their father's. Arabella sat at her easel beneath the ancient oak tree, her brush capturing the golden light that dappled across the manicured lawns, while Sebastian reclined nearby with a book open upon his knee. Though she noticed with warm amusement that his gaze strayed far more often to his family than to the printed page, watching his daughters with an expression of tender wonder that still made her heart flutter after all these years. The twins, Eleanor and Catherine, had arrived 2 years into their marriage, their birth transforming Sebastian in ways that society found almost comical. The formerly fearsome Duke of Ashworth now routinely appeared at breakfast with ribbon remnants tangled in his dark hair, submitted to elaborate tea parties with imaginary guests, and had been spotted by multiple witnesses crawling through the gardens on hands and knees, playing at being a dragon, while his daughters shrieked with terrified delight atop the garden wall. "Papa, Papa, come see what we found," Eleanor called, her small hand clasped around something that wriggled, and Sebastian set aside his book with theatrical reluctance that fooled no one, striding across the lawn to inspect their treasure with the same grave attention he would give matters of state, and Arabella smiled as she watched him crouch beside them, his deep voice carrying across the garden as he solemnly identified the frog and negotiated its release back to the pond. A footman appeared at her elbow with a silver tray bearing the afternoon post, and Arabella sorted through invitations and correspondence until her fingers stilled upon a letter bearing a familiar seal, the Ashworth barony. Marcus's family and curiosity prompted her to break the wax and unfold the pages within, her eyes scanning the contents with growing astonishment, as the tale of Marcus's downfall revealed itself in his mother's desperate hand, begging the Duke's intervention in saving what remained of their holdings. Financial ruin had come swiftly in the end, unwise investments compounded by his wife's extravagant spending, and the heiress who had seemed such a prize had departed for the continent with a younger man, leaving Marcus alone in a crumbling estate with nothing but his bitterness for company. Arabella read the letter twice, waiting to feel satisfaction or vindication, but discovered within herself only a distant pity for a man who had never learned that true worth could not be measured in pounds and social standing, who had discarded genuine affection in pursuit of hollow prizes, and now faced the consequences of his shallow choices. She would show the letter to Sebastian later, and together they would decide what charity, if any, to extend. But for now she set it aside and returned her attention to the canvas before her, to the dappled light, and the sound of her daughter's laughter, and her husband's patient voice, explaining the life cycle of frogs with complete seriousness, and she thought of how close she had come to letting fear win, to spending her life behind walls of her own construction, never knowing that this profound joy awaited her on the other side of vulnerability. The evening descended upon Blackwood Manor in shades of amber and rose, painting the sky above the ancient oaks in colors that seemed to mirror the warmth, suffusing every corner of Arabella's heart as she stood beside Sebastian on the terrace, watching their daughters chase fireflies across the darkening lawn, while the first stars emerged like scattered diamonds against the deepening blue. And in this perfect moment of domestic tranquility, she felt the full weight of her blessings settle around her shoulders like the softest cashmere shawl, warming her against the gentle evening breeze that carried the scent of roses and honeysuckle from the gardens below. Sebastian's arm encircled her waist with the easy familiarity of years, drawing her against his side as the children's laughter rose and fell like music, and when he spoke his voice held that note of tender amusement she had come to cherish above all other sounds in the world, that warmth which only she and their daughters ever heard beneath his still formidable public demeanor. "Do you remember," he murmured against her hair, "what you told me the day you accepted my proposal, that declaration you made with such fierce certainty?" Arabella laughed, the sound carrying across the terrace like bells, and she turned in his embrace to face him, her grey eyes meeting his dark ones with all the love she had once sworn she would never feel again, shining openly in their depths. "I told you I would never love you," she admitted, "and I meant every word at the time. For I was so certain that my heart was beyond repair, so determined that I would never again risk the devastation of loving and losing." Sebastian's smile was that same knowing expression she remembered from 5 years past, patient and warm and touched with gentle triumph, and he raised one hand to cup her cheek with a tenderness that still made her breath catch, even after all this time. "And I smiled," he said softly, "because I knew something you did not, that a heart capable of such fierce self-protection was also capable of equally fierce love, that walls built so high could only have been constructed by someone with boundless depths of feeling to protect, and that if I could only prove myself worthy of trust, those walls would eventually crumble." She leaned into his touch, marveling still at how this stern, imposing man had become her safe harbor, her dearest friend, her passionate lover, and the most devoted father she could have imagined. "You were patient when you had every right to demand, kind when you could have been cold, and you loved me quietly and consistently until I could not help but love you in return. You taught me that the truest romances are not built upon grand declarations and instant passion, but upon the steady foundation of friendship, respect, and countless small kindnesses that accumulate into something unshakable." The children's voices called them to admire captured fireflies glowing in small hands, and as they walked together across the lawn to join their daughters, Arabella knew with profound certainty that this life, this love, was the unexpected gift she had never dared to hope for. And to all of you who have journeyed with us, through heartbreak and healing, through guarded hearts and gentle awakenings, through the slow and beautiful unfolding of love, from the most unpromising of beginnings, I offer my deepest gratitude and this simple truth, that hearts can heal, that love can surprise us, that vulnerability is not weakness but the greatest courage, and that sometimes the person who seems least likely to capture our hearts is the very one destined to cherish them forever. So may you too find your own unexpected love, your own patient heart, your own happily ever after.